Africa is not just a place on the map, it is the foundation of the human story. And yet, for centuries, its history has been shortened, distorted, or completely ignored. What most people know about Africa is only a fragment, a small, incomplete version of a much larger, far more powerful reality. To truly understand Africa, you have to go back not hundreds, not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of years. Because this is where everything begins. Experts estimate that humans have been in Africa for roughly 300,000 years, while the migration out of Africa between 60,000 and 90,000 years ago. Long before the rise of civilizations, before the first cities, before written language, early humans were already living, thinking, adapting, and surviving across the vast and diverse landscapes of Africa. From dense rainforests to open savannas, from deserts to fertile river valleys, Africa shaped the human body and mind. This is where the earliest tools were made, where fire was controlled, where language likely began to form. And then something happened that would change the course of the entire planet. Groups of humans began to leave Africa. Over thousands of years, they spread into the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. No matter how far they traveled, their origin remained the same. Africa was and still is the birthplace of humanity. But the story does not stop there. One of the biggest misconceptions about Africa is that after these early migrations, the continent somehow fell behind while the rest of the world developed. That idea is not just wrong, it is deeply misleading. Because while other regions were forming their own civilizations, Africa was doing the same, in its own way, at its own pace, and often at an extraordinary level of complexity. Along the Nile, one of the most iconic civilizations emerged, ancient Egypt. Egypt was not an isolated wonder. It was part of Africa, deeply connected to the continent through trade, culture, and geography. Its achievements in engineering, medicine, mathematics, and governance were groundbreaking. The pyramids were symbols of organization, labor coordination, and architectural precision on a massive scale. Egypt developed one of the earliest writing systems and a state structure that lasted for thousands of years. But focusing only on Egypt hides a much bigger truth. Africa was filled with powerful civilizations. South of Egypt, along the Nile, rose the kingdom of Kush, which once conquered Egypt and ruled as pharaohs. Kush's cities thrived on trade, and its people mastered ironworking earlier than many other parts of the world. Further east, the kingdom of Axum was one of the great trading empires of the ancient world. It connected Africa to Rome, India, and the Middle East through vast and highly efficient trade networks. Axum produced its own currency and became one of the earliest major kingdoms to adopt Christianity, shaping the cultural and religious identity of the region for centuries. In the heart of the Sahel, a different power rose across trade routes that cut through the Sahara Desert, fueled by valuable resources. The Empire of Ghana was one of the first great West African states, growing wealthy by controlling the trade of gold and salt. But Ghana was only the beginning. It was followed by the even greater Empire of Mali. Mali became one of the richest empires in history, led by famous rulers. Mansa Musa is often considered the wealthiest individual to have ever lived. His pilgrimage to Mecca was so grand that it affected economies along his route, spreading gold across regions. Under Mali, cities flourished, especially Timbuktu, which became one of the greatest centers of learning in the entire world. Timbuktu was a respected intellectual hub where scholars gathered to study law, science, astronomy, and medicine. After Mali came the Empire of Songhai, which expanded even further. It strengthened administration and education, continuing the legacy of intellectual and economic growth across the vast West African region. In southern Africa, massive stone structures like Great Zimbabwe were built without mortar, demonstrating advanced architectural techniques. Across Central Africa, kingdoms like Congo developed complex political systems. In East Africa, Swahili city-states thrived along the coast, blending African, Arab, and Asian influences into a vibrant culture. These cities traded gold, ivory, and goods across the Indian Ocean, linking Africa to global networks long before European arrival. Africa was not isolated. It was connected, active, and influential. So what changed? The answer lies in two major disruptions that reshaped the continent: slavery and colonization. The transatlantic slave trade was one of the most devastating events in human history. Over several centuries, millions of Africans were taken from their homes. This was not just a loss of population. It was a loss of knowledge, leadership, and stability. Entire regions were weakened and thrown into cycles of conflict. In the late 19th century, European powers began dividing Africa among themselves in the scramble for Africa. Borders were drawn with rulers on maps ignoring ethnic groups, languages, and existing political systems. Communities that had lived separately were forced together, while other cohesive groups were suddenly split apart. Resources were extracted: gold, rubber, oil, while local populations were often exploited for labor. Education systems were reshaped to serve colonial goals. African history was rewritten or dismissed. Generations grew up learning more about Europe than about their own heritage, but even under these conditions, Africa resisted. There were revolutions, movements, and leaders who refused to accept foreign control. By the mid-20th century, waves of independence swept across the continent. Nations began reclaiming their sovereignty, their identity, and their future. Yet the effects of colonization did not disappear overnight. Economic challenges and artificial borders remained. Alongside these struggles came resilience, creativity, and growth. Today, Africa is one of the most dynamic regions in the world. Its population is young, and its cities are expanding rapidly. Its influence in technology, music, culture, and global affairs is rising. Perhaps most importantly, Africans are reclaiming their story. Africa was never behind, empty, or waiting to be discovered. It was building civilizations when others were still forming, and trading across continents when others were isolated. It was teaching, innovating, and evolving in ways that shaped the world. The problem was never Africa's history. It was how that history was told. Now that story is being rewritten with evidence, voices, and truth. When you finally see the full picture, you realize something powerful. Africa is not just part of history. Africa is the beginning of it. And its story is still being written by 1.4 billion voices across 54 sovereign nations. During the colonial period, specifically after the Berlin Conference of 1884, approximately 90% of Africa came under European control. This rapid partitioning drastically altered the geopolitical landscape, yet the pre-colonial history remains a testament to the continent's enduring legacy and the strength of its diverse indigenous political structures. As of 2024, Africa has the youngest population in the world, with a median age of around 19 years. This demographic trend suggests that the continent will continue to play a pivotal role in global labor, markets, and cultural innovation as a new generation of creators and entrepreneurs takes the stage. In the realm of trade, the trans-Saharan routes were so effective that by the 14th century, the Mali Empire was responsible for nearly half of the Old World's gold supply. This economic dominance facilitated the rise of educational centers like the University of Sankore in Timbuktu, where manuscripts were highly valued. Architectural feats like the Great Zimbabwe ruins cover nearly 1,800 acres and were constructed using dry stone techniques that remain a subject of study for modern engineers. These structures served as the capital of a kingdom that thrived between the 11th and 15th centuries, trading with distant lands across the sea. The linguistic diversity of the continent is staggering, with over 2,000 distinct languages spoken today. This diversity is a direct result of the long history of human adaptation and migration across varied ecological zones. Modern technological shifts are also evident. Africa has one of the highest rates of mobile money adoption globally. In countries like Kenya, platforms like M-Pesa have transformed the economy, showing how the continent continues to innovate in the 21st century. Urbanization is another key metric, with cities like Lagos projected to become the world's most populous. This reflects the shift from agrarian societies to industrial and Service-based economies. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, over 30 African nations gained independence, marking a significant shift in the global political order. These movements were led by intellectuals who utilized both traditional values and modern strategies. The preservation of history is now being bolstered by genetic research and archaeology, which confirm Africa's ancestral status. Economic integration is progressing with the African Continental Free Trade Area of CFTA, which aims to create the world's largest free trade area. Environmental stewardship is also a priority, with the Great Green Wall project aiming to restore 100 million hectares of degraded land across the Sahel by 2030. The narrative of Africa is shifting from one of aid to one of investment. Global investors are looking toward African markets for long-term growth, recognizing the untapped potential. History is not a linear progression from primitive to advanced, but a complex tapestry of human effort, environmental adaptation, and cultural exchange. Africa is a story of beginning, endurance, and a future still unfolding. When we acknowledge this truth, we don't just learn about Africa, we learn about the very essence of humanity. The problem was never the history itself, but the lens through which it was viewed. By shifting that lens, we see a resilient spirit,